Okay, how about now? Okay, can you hear me now? Yes, no? Now it's supposed to show me that there is something happening. At least I get the microphone indicator. Excellent. All right. Sorry, in the process, I managed to drop my whole entire mess of camera, cables, chargers, and all sort of stuff. So everything ended up on the floor. And I don't think I pointed the camera the right way. Not quite. See, like, I bet you don't care that I'm not in the center of the image, but it's going to trigger my OCD and piss me off thoroughly. Hold on one sec. Almost there, gents. I do apologize. It was all supposed to work, but, like all good plans, everything stops working when you need it the most. Okay. All right. I think we are more or less okay here, so I'll continue. If it was easy, anyone can do it. The funny part is that the audio video, in principle, is the easiest part of this. The basic problem is that I've spent so much time experimenting with different setups, mounts, cables, all sort of thing, that I ended up with an incoherent mess of crap. In principle, I need to just go through it, order a few longer cables, nail everything to the wall, and it's all going to be good. Now I have my desk. I have a standing desk. On one end of it is a computer, and another end, all this paraphernalia of equipment. Well, the things I do, this is the simplest, and that's probably why I don't pay enough attention to it, and that's why that's what usually brings me down. Oh, I think that is the best question. Are you AI? Do I sound like AI? I don't think anybody has ever asked me that. So my nephews used to tell me that I sound like Gru, between the accent and I guess the vocabulary and stuff like that. But AI, I think that's the first. All right, where was I? Scope mounts. So why are we talking about scope mounts? While, given that scope mounts are generally pretty seemingly straightforward thing. I get asked about scope mounts all the freaking time, and for a good reason. There is a surprising number of problems, issues of all sorts with scope mounts that impact how you shoot, how well you shoot, how consistently you shoot. And when you're not shooting well, one of the things you immediately start doing, you start trying to figure out what was wrong. 90% of the time, what's wrong is you. Vast majority of the time, it's not the arrow, it's the Indian. But sometimes it is the equipment, the rifle, the optic, the scope mount. When people blame the scope, a significant amount of time, often enough, most of the time probably, it comes down to either the scope mount being not of high quality, or even if the scope mount is of reasonable quality, it was not set up correctly. It was not set up with sufficient attention to detail, And that it probably comes from the fact that scope mounts look simple, and they're just not as simple as many people seem to think. Right, Mr. Slevguns is with us. I can add him to the stream. Okay, he gives me a thumbs up, so he is going to join me. And there he is.
Hello, everybody. Ilya, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to pop in and to learn from you as always. And it kind of gets me off, so I haven't done anything like gun related in the last about say 2 months. So it's nice to be here and doing this. And now I can't hear you. Ilya, I cannot hear you, sir. Okay. Ilya, I think check your you might be muted. Okay, so it looks like it is not me that's having the
How about now?
We can hear you. Quite a bit of reverb, but
for fuck's sake.
You're good. You're okay. It's good enough.
All right. Good enough? Okay. Death, taxes, and microphones not working. This time around, I actually don't know what it was. So go figure.
It seems like either like
All
your main. It seems like your main mic or the battery or something just cut off completely.
I don't know. It's all supposed to be charged. When I started, you weren't here. When I started my, big microphone that I normally use, this thing completely crapped out. So I switched to the DJI that I normally use, and it was working. And then it died, and then it started working again, and everything is charged. So go figure. I don't know. I'm not gonna try to psychoanalyze it today.
You know what it is? It's an optics company that's trying to they hacked your computer because they don't want you to talk sense and talk bad about them because they know what's coming.
Yeah, in this case, it would be a scope mount company. I am gonna refrain from bad mouthing too many optics companies today. I'm gonna rip a bunch of mount companies a new one, but it's not even that. Honestly, let me do this basic introduction.
Absolutely.
The way I want to approach this is, and I hope this is something that's appropriate for you guys. I like to think I have a very intelligent audience. And if it wasn't for Mr. Slevguns, it would probably be true. Hey, you volunteered to come here.
Okay, well, so because you mentioned that your audience is more intelligent, I'm not gonna share this with my stream because you know what
There we go. Perfect. You're trying to scare me. But anyhow,
I'm not. I just don't want to bring down the average IQ level here.
All right, we'll run some tests, do some measurements. Let's see what kind of questions they get. But anyhow, because of that, so my approach to scope mounts, like my approach to optics and a lot of other things, is that I'll be happy to discuss specific scope mounts if I have any experience with them. But I want to talk about really is more general principles. I think we get wrapped around the axle on the details that are interesting looking, but not important. I want to talk about what matters in rifle scope design, what we as consumers can look for, because we cannot. None of us, most of us, don't have the tools to do proper FA and really figure out what's happening. We don't know enough about cross sections and material science. Now, some of us do. Most of us don't design these things. Even the mechanical engineers in the audience, you don't spend your time thinking about rifle scope mounts, right?
As you're thinking about framing this conversation, one thing I would actually love to know, and I'm sure it's on top of a lot of our viewers' minds, because like you mentioned, I mean, like a lot of the people who watch your channel, watch my channel, you will have one cross section of people that's really in tune with this, and they look at the individual details, they understand the theories behind it. And then we truly have a bunch of people who are watching the channel. They they watch the streams, they like, oh wow, this guy seems like he knows what he's talking about, so let me skip to his recommendations and just do that. However, they take those recommendations and oftentimes they might not be able to find that product. So I think if in the way that you're framing the conversation, I think if you can discuss why that specific thing is important and just kind of like the more
I will
broader
talk about
theory,
that.
because I think that's going to be really helpful. Yeah,
that's in the plan. I'm gonna try to show you how to play the odds with mounts, and this is a very, very important point. Most scope mounts work with most scopes for most users, right? That's one of the reasons we have scope mounts from $30 to $800. They're sold in comparatively significant numbers, especially $30 ones. And there's clearly enough people over there using $30 rings, and they're holding zero, and they're okay, right?
Yes.
That means that I can't tell you, oh, this particular mount, you are guaranteed for it to break on you. Well, okay, if it's a $5 ring made out of pot metal in the south of China, you using the stone tools, yes, okay. Outside of that, I can tell you, okay, do not buy this ring. You're gonna go buy this ring, mount it on your scope, go shoot, and it's gonna stay zeroed, and you're gonna call me on the bullshit, right?
Absolutely.
This is not how this works. Scope mounts fail when the conditions get rigorous and when tolerances stack up. And this idea of a tolerance stack up becomes important when we start talking about scope mounts. Okay, are you guys all with me? You know what tolerance stack up means? Do I need to explain what that is, or is everybody clear on that?
I think you should, if you give it like a quick highlight of that.
Okay, all right. So guys, I'm looking at the comments. If something comes up, this is not intended to be a lecture. Stop me, ask questions anytime. Okay. So what is the tolerance stack up? Let's say I have a rifle scope. Let me change the view so that you get, there we go. Have a rifle scope. This is an element Titan 3 to 18. It's sitting in element rings. Okay. So when the scope tube is machined, they're trying to machine it to be 34 millimeters, but nothing in this world made by man is perfect. So there's going to be some sort of a tolerance. 34 millimeters plus minus something. Okay. When they machine the rings, they're trying to make the inner surface perfectly circular and 34 millimeters in diameter. Okay. Except nothing in this world is ever perfect. So they try to make it 34 millimeters on the inside. They try to make it perfectly round. There is a spec on how outer round it can be, and also on the diameter itself, right? So they're trying to make the inner diameter of the ring 34 millimeters. So it's going to be 34 millimeters plus minus something, some sort of a tolerable error, right? And if it's a good company, they will be doing some sort of quality control. They'll be checking everything. They're doing quick measurement. They'll look at, okay, it's not 34 millimeters, it's 34.01, and that's within spec. Move right along. Okay. All right, we've got the resident clown here. Mr. Northwest Guns is wondering what is a scope mount. I am not gonna honor that with a response because honestly, it's too easy. Okay.
Well, and despite his name, he's actually your neighbor right now. He's in Mr. Arizona Guns.
Yeah, pretty much. All right. Oh, Bullets for Bucks. Steven is here. Steve, give me a thumbs up when you're ready to be edited. You're good? All right. Excellent. The more the merrier. I have more people to abuse.
If it got bad feedback or anything, I never use this setup. This is not my normal studio.
That's okay.
It's okay.
Some of us don't have the option of multiple studios, but hey,
Yeah, it's been a crazy busy year and week, especially. So I'm running a different camera, no fancy audio, and
you actually sound pretty good, better than usual. Maybe you should do this.
it's
anyhow.
Insta 360.
Okay, never mind. I take that back. No, it's actually pretty good. It's a surprisingly good camera.
Your students are here, and we're ready to listen. Educate us, our Lord.
Yeah. I'm specifically wearing glasses so that I would look smarter than I really am. Actually, that's not why I'm wearing glasses. I was sparring today and got poked in the eye. So my left eye doesn't focus and I don't want to put contacts in there.
Oh, and here I thought you were going for the naughty teacher look.
Yeah. I'm wearing a thong underneath all this. And that's how we lost. And that's how we lost bullets for bugs. So what I was talking about was a tolerance stack up. Yeah. How does the tolerance stack up work, right? So you have a ring. A ring has two halves. If it was made out of one piece, it's comparatively related tolerance. If they were made out of two pieces, each one will have its own set of tolerances and all that. The way machining usually works, there are random errors and there are systemic errors. Random errors are we're trying to machine a 34 millimeter tube, and sometimes it's 34.01, sometimes it's 33.99, something like that. It can go either way. These are random errors. Sometimes you have some sort of systemic errors as you are making these scope tubes or rings or whatever else on a particular machine. The cutting tool wears very, very slowly over time. Eventually, the tools need to be replaced, resharpened, whatever. So you can start having this manufacturing drift. And if there are any manufacturing engineers here, I apologize if I'm not using the right terminology. I'm a physicist, not a manufacturing engineer, but I've made a lot of stuff over the years. And I have a very good idea of how this crap fails, unfortunately. So if you the tools start to wear all of a sudden, if you manufacture 100 rings, you measure them all. If the equipment was new, there would be a spread of around 34 millimeters, a little bit higher, a little bit lower. Once the equipment starts wearing, the average is no longer 34 millimeters. It will become, let's say, 34.05 millimeters, and the spread is going to be around that. Okay. And we don't know for sure what the tolerances are. Manufacturers do not disclose it, and for a good reason. What can happen is that you start getting this run out. And depending on when this particular ring was made, and depending on how thoroughly they were doing quality control, and depending on the day of the week, right? If they found this on Tuesday, they went and redid the tools and set everything up and started a new batch. And if this was on Friday and they were trying to get the hell out of there and go to the weekend, they packed them up and shipped them. Okay? Ask me how I know. When I was at one working, as a young engineer many years ago, at one of the major aerospace contractors, we had this camera we had to ship to the government. And one of the tests for these cameras, something called MRTD, minimum resolvable temperature difference. It is a big-ass cameras that are sitting on satellites tracking your ass all over the world. The way this test works, somebody has to sit there, look at the screen and say, okay, there's a particular feature projected to a camera, and can I see it? Can I not see it? Can I see it? Can I not see it? Right? And you're trying to see very small details. It's a test that has a person in the loop. And normally we would run these cameras and you can't quite see a small enough detail. You can't ship it. You have to go realign it, do some work. Every once in a while, our esteemed management was really, really pushing us to ship the cameras. And I have somewhat weird eyes. I see some shades of gray and things that most people do not. So if they really needed to ship a camera, they'd ask me to go downstairs, and rather than the normal technician sitting there looking at images, they'd ask me to do it. If I'm looking at the images, I can see more shades of gray than most people, and I can see objects that are not as well defined. I can see them quite clearly, and if I'm running the test, all of a sudden this camera passes instead of failing. And if I couldn't pass it and we really needed to ship a few cameras, we had a mechanical engineer in the adjacent building. He was colorblind. He could see shades of gray that I can't even imagine. And if we were running the test with him in the loop, all of a sudden a lot more stuff passes. Right? That's how manufacturing works, unfortunately. All too often, we do not know what happens behind there. So let's say you got a scope that was made on Friday, and the scope's tube is, 34.1 millimeters. That's a huge runout. They're never quite that big, but okay. And then you had a set of rings that were made on a different Friday by a different company, and that one happened to be erring on the other side. Now that one is a 33.9. for the lower half and 34.2 for the upper half of the ring. It all comes to you, and you haven't really thought about it too much. You take the same range that you just used to put tires on your car, tighten those screws a little bit, and what you got there is a tolerance stack up. It's tighter than a paratrooper's asshole when his parachute didn't open, and the scope is still going to slip. Okay. Make sense? You with me?
Yep.
So that's basically what's called a tolerance stack up. Scopes slip or get damaged or bind most of the time when you have some case of a tolerance stack up and adverse shooting conditions. What is adverse shooting conditions? Well, the gentleman on the bottom of the screen, his name is Steven. He pretends to be Bullets for Bucks, but he's really Steven. So he's a hunter. That means that everywhere he goes, he carries this 5.5-pound rifle that shoots 4068 Ultra Super Magnum. That's like a 1-pound bullet going 10,000 foot per second. That thing has a little recoil. Okay. Slightly out of spec rings, slightly out of spec scope on that gun means he didn't shoot anything he planned to shoot. Okay. That is when failures happen. Lightweight guns, improper mounting, out of spec tubes, out of spec rings. And the actual mode of failures can vary dramatically depending whether it's too loose or too tight, or front and back ring are different, or you got them in a particular a spot on a tube where you are changing the shape of the scope tube and impacting something inside. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail momentarily, right? And then you go and say, oh my goodness, my scope doesn't work, right? It so happens there are a few rifle scope manufacturers. I go and visit them. I have some professional reasons to visit them, and I do so as a part of my whole gun writing thing. And a couple of times with different manufacturers, I went to where they're doing to where the service department sits, where they look at rifle scopes that come back, and to see what they do with them. I listen to how they call back customers, trying to figure out what's what. More than half the time, a lot more than half the time, when the scope is sent back, they cannot replicate the problem. And not for the lack of trying. I've seen what they do to them. I don't do this to my scopes. They legitimately abuse them, hit them, slam them, do weird things to them. They can't replicate the problem. They can't replicate the problem because most of the time it's either the shooter or the rifle or the mounting system. Okay. You with me so far?
Yeah. Can I ask a question?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Or make a mention to. So the only time, maybe not, but probably the only time I've ever had a scope that I've noticed has slipped in the rings, which I'm sure it's happened. I've never noticed it, but like where it was a lot was on an ultra lightweight backpacking rifle, an ultra lightweight rifle, 300 PRC, which is pretty without. I don't think it has. I might have had a muzzle brake, but I don't think so. And it was. I think the rings were admittedly very cheap, and I didn't lap them or anything, which I have a question about that too. But they were very cheap rings. It was a very expensive scope, and it slipped like a half an inch after shooting. Like
that's a lot. That's huge. So slipping is only one possible problem. There are a lot of problems that can happen without the scope actually slipping. Okay. I gotta know this. So, Mr. Balinfinity, I saw your question. I'll get back to that in a sec. So, two of my favorite YouTubers.
Such abuse.
So, which two? And think carefully before you answer that question.
He did. He answered.
Oh, never mind. It was answered. Okay, very good. That makes sense. I'm good with that. Yeah. Hey, I told you when you volunteered to come here, you were basically volunteering to be a punching bag.
My entire channel is all self-deprecating humor. Come on. Now, and
I
actually,
know.
I'm glad that Steven brought it up. So I had it on my notebook. I didn't want to interrupt you, but I did have a question about lapping the rings.
Mhm.
So I've never done that in the past, and I know like there's a lot of people who swear by it, and I'm just wondering if this comes from possibly a time where machining was not as precise, that lapping the rings accomplished something that is possibly no longer required with tighter tolerances and like a better tolerance stack.
So, okay, there we go. So, Mr. Randall Carey. If you don't know Randall, he does a lot of work with Arcane Optics, and despite that, still talks to me. It's amazing. No, I don't say anything bad about Arcane. Actually, surprisingly decent scopes, but surprisingly to me, I was pleasantly surprised when I started looking at them. But anyhow, to lap or not to lap. So lapping started before proper CNC machining of everything. So what was basically happening, if you think about it, the whole business with long monolithic Picatinny rails on everything is a comparatively recent invention. You know, if you think back 20 years ago, I don't know if you're old enough, were you still in your diapers 20 years ago or not?
Not me.
Maybe,
Maybe Steven. I think who's the youngest one in our bunch?
No, I was out of diapers for a while 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Well, I'm 40.
I'm 47.
Yeah, 36, so I'm younger, but
Oh, forgot.
Alex,
I'm
Mr.
surrounded by
Affordable,
children.
Mr.
Kindergarten.
Affordable Optics is the child in our group.
Yeah, that's a good point.
yeah, and he looks the prettiest too.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry.
Not even according to his wife, but okay.
That's all the steroids there in the public water in Canada.
Yeah. I feel great when I take like prescription steroids, so I can only imagine what the anabolic type do. But
I don't do steroids. If you have natural beauty, you don't need to. But anyhow.
Well, I need to then for sure because I don't have.
Yeah, absolutely. Lapping the rings. So if you think back on 20 years ago, the vast majority of rifles you had, the actions were not machined terribly well. There were always some, like Tikas never needed this shit and all that. But if you a bunch of spotterized Mausers, Remington 700s that were, made by hand using like nails and files and teeth, whatever the hell else they used in upstate New York on trying to make the worst rifles known to man, and all that sort of stuff. And then we had two-piece bases, right? One base would go on the front bridge, and one base would go on the rear bridge. And they would be attached usually via 2 holes each, and those holes were also drilled, I think, by hand with no power tools most of the time, and all sort of jazz. The front and rear base did not align to each other, and half the time did not align to the barrel either. So what people started to do, okay, you put one ring in the front, one ring in the back. Original standard mounts had some of this adjustment built in, but they were weaker mounts because only the front ring was holding the recoil. The rear ring was just for windage, right? We started using Weaver, and you start using Weaver, the ring, if it's properly designed, locks tightly to the base, except the bases are not like this, they're like this. So what do? You get your lapping rod and you lap the rings.
Can I make...
Of course.
I mean, like, so it's funny that you did this live stream because about a week ago, I had a YouTube short where I mounted a scope in 60 seconds. Of course, it was cut down from maybe 10 minutes of time or something. And partly I had to make it quick and cut some things out kind of because it was 60 seconds. But I mean, the comment section, of course, is World War III. And I did it
usually like that because everybody's a professional, right?
But like, of course, you should have lapped the rings. And like, my opinion is like, I guess it's not I feel like it's not a bad thing to do. It probably wouldn't hurt it.
Yeah, it is.
It is a bad thing? Okay.
With modern, so it depends on what you're using, right? If you have some old rifle, everything's misaligned, you may have to. So my take on it is really very simple, and I'm going to be doing this thing through this live stream, like I said, playing the odds. How do you minimize the odds of your mounting system failing on you. Okay. The moment, so if you notice, whenever you buy rings, they're finished on the inside, right?
Mm-hmm.
The moment anodized, blued, parkerized, whatever the material is, and the moment you start lapping them, you remove all of that. So now they're
Mm-hmm.
gonna start oxidizing, reacting with shit, rusting if it's steel, and all sort of stuff. There's no compelling reason to do this. The day I discovered Burris's signature rings with plastic inserts is the day lapping rings became unnecessary.
Okay. And I didn't lap my rings. I didn't lap the rings in my video, and I took a lot of
dirt. We have somebody else who just joined us. That's Mr. Northwest Guns, the guy who doesn't know what a scope mount is. Perfect. Just in the right place. Okay. Okay. Derek, how old are you?
How old? 38, be 39 in 2 weeks.
Oh, great. I'm surrounded by kindergarten. Okay.
I'm surrounded by bald people.
This is true.
You should probably learn some lessons from that, yes.
But at least we can grow a beard. I mean,
you're bald, you just don't want to give into it yet. You're holding on with a thin string of hair.
Oh yeah.
I have more hair than all of you, but in order to make this program somewhat children friendly, I'm not going to take the shirt off, okay? My great grandmother sinned with a cave bear. It runs in the family. Where was I? Oh yeah, lapping. The basic problem with lapping, like I said, you remove the finish, you are changing the geometry, depending on how much you had to lap, you're changing the cross sections. Now, hopefully you had to lap very little, it doesn't take all that much. But once you start lapping, I've done it many times. I have several lapping kits still, sitting rusting away somewhere since I stopped using them. But you can screw things up. On top of it, if you don't do it just right, you may not necessarily have fixed the problem. You have probably introduced a few. At some point, I discovered Burris's original signature rings. They had these plastic inserts that would self-align to the tube of the scope and allow you to build in some offset, and that changed everything, because now not only could you have perfect alignment of the bearing surfaces on the front and in the back, but you also could add offsets in case none of this shit was pointing in the same direction as the barrel, which used to be fairly common, right? In the 20, 25 years ago, a lot of people started talking about, we need rifle scopes with a lot of adjustment. SWFA 10 power scopes originally, the fixed power scopes, originally got a lot of mileage because they had 130, 140 MOA of adjustment 30 years ago, right? Why did that matter? Well, partly because people were dialing for distance. But the biggest reason was that if you had this rifle of indeterminate origin with mounts of indeterminate origin that were lapped 4 times by different, I hate mosquitoes, lapped 4 times by different people before you bought it used at the local gun store, you had no idea where any of this stuff was pointing. And you put an SWFA scope on it, twist the turrets, and you're pointing in the right direction, right? The moment we had Burris signature rings, it became obsolete. The day before I discovered those rings was the last time I lapped scope rings.
So here's a question. I know when it comes, let's say, for example, like one of the reasons we all go with chassis guns is because it's going to provide a rigid platform. And you kind of have that rigid interaction between the scope and the rings. But by introducing polymer inserts, wouldn't that create an induced flex and an extra piece between the ring and the scope, or not enough to actually make any difference?
So think of it as a gasket. As you compress the rings, it basically serves as a gasket. The plastic is softer than the ring and softer than the scope tube. And it will compress slightly, and that should create a lot of friction. Nothing's going to slide. But yet they are not so stiff to induce unnecessary pressure on scope tube.
Cool.
Okay. Now, if you use the wrong plastic, you can screw this up. Burris, in this case, did not screw it up. Right, before I continue with the rest of this lecture, let's glance at the comments real quick, and then I'll continue to part 2 of this. And if you guys have other questions, please go for it. Okay. Aerotech scope mounts. I have one. It's well made. I have the adjuster slope mount that I use for long range. But
Optima makes a great scope mount. They're out of Massachusetts.
yeah, there are a lot of companies that make good scope mounts. I don't know them all. It's impossible for me to see them all.
I will say Sunway Photo having some good scope rings too. I have them on that rifle behind me.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, but anyhow, so Aerotech I've been pretty happy with. So, let's see what else we got. User error. I'll talk about that. Another question about lap or not lap. I think we just got that.
There really is no need to lap scope rings anymore. At least in my opinion, most of them are really well made. And
yeah, correct. So the need for lapping is driven by rings and receiver. It's going to be hard to say with confidence that it is not needed, obsolete. In the modern world with the modern equipment, if it's a good quality rifle, if it's a single long rail, or if the top of the receiver is machined, if you put it on and you think something is binding, it needs to be lapped, return it to the manufacturer, whichever piece you think is out of spec. I would not lap. And yeah, some of the old school integral mounts was sketchy as hell. That is spectacularly charitable.
mm-hmm.
Let's see. Okay, Slav, I think your buddy over here is he has a bald head envy.
Well, Buzz is actually a clown, so he has plenty of wigs, so you can pick the color, and I'm sure he'll give you a full set of hair.
I don't know.
We should do that for SHOT Show. We're gonna do something like that.
When you say we, I assume you don't mean me. Okay.
You're getting involved with this one.
All right. It is a good question. Do you ever choose to use split rings over one-piece mounts nowadays? For weight, maybe. No, not just for weight. It depends on a rifle. So for a lot of one-piece, a lot of modern scopes have fairly large turret saddle, and comparatively low one-piece mounts don't work with them. Actually, the Aerotech mount that I have is one of those. Like all these new Zeiss scopes and the new Schmidt, I cannot use in the Aerotech mount because the turret saddle, basically this part here, protrudes sufficiently far down below the scope tube that I just don't have space for it. Another one is on conventionally stocked rifles. Depending on how the stock is set up, etc., I want to choose a very specific scope height. And the scope height depends I don't necessarily want it too low or too high. It just depends on where my head is, right? So the scope height will be chosen based on the stock, and then the stock fit. Sometimes I'd want it fairly low. If you want it fairly low, one-piece mounts usually do not work. However, go ahead.
I was gonna say we're getting some really awesome questions in here. I'm just browsing through them.
This is very, very good.
Well, I want to say it really depends on what the person's budget is for their build. If you can afford a one piece, go with a one piece. If you have to go to a split ring system, like I use split ring system majority of the time for PRS rifles. My ELR rifles, on the other hand, I put a one piece scope mount because of the rigidity and the force of the recoil of a bigger caliber.
Oftentimes with hunting, people use like tally rings where the mount's integral with the separate rings. You know what I'm saying? So it's not one piece in the sense that you guys are talking about, but it's one pieces and you're not using a Picatinny
It's a
rail.
base integrated with the ring. The steel ones work reasonably well. Some others bind scopes in an odd way. So we can.
Most of the time, it's hunting. From a hunting standpoint, it's just because they want lighter weight. They want to have it as light as possible.
With modern CNC equipment, vast majority of the time, they can be machined precisely enough where there should be very, very little run-out difference, tolerance difference between using split rings on a high-quality base versus a single-piece mount. I use single-piece mounts start having an advantage when the rings need to be tall. We all use single-piece mounts on AR-15s because of the height, and it just so happens most of these mounts are one piece.
Mm-hmm.
But if, for example, you have a chassis rifle with a significant amount of recoil, a one-piece mount is easier to hold up to the rigors of strange vibrations and all that than two separate rings, because of how they are clamped to the rail and how the rings are tied together.
Okay.
If you think about it, I don't have a single piece mount here. I have a couple of scopes here. They're all individual rings, right? If you think about it, so let's say I put this on a heavily recoiling rifle. The height of the ring basically becomes a lever. When this whole thing recoils, starts bending, etc. Having one more cross section here as an interconnect, in addition to the stiffness of the tube, actually makes this a somewhat stiffer structure. Without that interconnect piece, you're depending on the clamp holding onto the rail or top of the receiver, and where this clamp is, that becomes a somewhat weaker point. Does it happen commonly? No. Does it happen? Yes.
So here's a question, and I'm not an engineer, so you'll kind of have to like hopefully guess where I'm going
I'll
with this.
make fun of you either way. Don't worry about it.
It's okay. So you're talking about, so a one-piece mount is going to be more rigid, but if
properly made,
if properly made, is going to be more rigid. But by making it more rigid, would that possibly just transfer the forces to the next weakest point, which would be, let's say, the mount, the scope base itself mounted to the receiver?
Not necessarily, because
depends on how it's done. Once again,
with the force and the harmonics coming up through, the more stiffer it is, the more it's going to reject the harmonics from the rifle going into the scope.
Feel free to correct
them. Part of it. It's from a vibration standpoint, essentially, it acts as a low-pass filter.
Okay.
But regardless.
Okay.
Think of it this way. When the recoil happens, you want your rifle, scope mount, scope, you want everything to move as one piece.
Yes.
Okay.
Newton's law of physics number 2.
No. Number 3, but okay.
Close enough.
You're close. You were only one off. And one of the reasons you wanted to move, so when the mount is very stiff, you're actually transferring a little bit of this need to compensate to the internals of the scope. But if they're all moving together without too much flexing and all that sort of stuff, it's a longitudinal on-axis movement. And our scopes are built to withstand that very, very well.
Okay.
When stuff is flexing and moving and vibrating and doing weird shit, in addition to on-axis longitudinal movement, goes up, down, left, right, and bend and flex and all that, all the stuff inside the scope can move in 68 different directions, and that can actually cause problems.
Okay.
Once again, this is a somewhat extreme case. You need significant recoil. You need some weird-ass muzzle brake that will introduce strange recoil and all that sort of stuff, but it can happen. Okay. But anyhow, to answer the original question, yeah, I use split rings comparatively often, but it depends on application, depends on the height I need, depending on what's available in the market. I don't always get what I want. Right? On top of it, honestly, I mean, if you use some very basic engineering principles, scope mounts don't have to be this expensive, right? One of the reasons they're so expensive, especially nice ones, is that most of the machine shops where they're made in the USSR, they're just not set up for volume. They're not set up for low-cost production. I know a guy who is trying to change that a little bit. So,
well, I'm sure you got to pay the marketing people and the YouTube people as well.
Look, there are a lot of expenses and all that, but I'm not itching to buy $400 mount. I'll be honest with you. And I've been very actively trying to set this up. I do not want to pay more than $150 to $100 for a single piece. I don't want to pay more than $80 to $100, hopefully less.
But here's the question, and you know that somebody is going to chime in on this one, especially from your audience. Where, I mean, let's put it this way. I mean, you can say that you're a very, I would say, similar to sophisticated, but you're very choosy, and you definitely value quality optics. So somebody can easily say, well, it's like, well, why, if you're buying a $4,000 ZCO tangent fade or whatever, why go with $150 mount when somebody's selling this mount for $400 or $500? Because it means it must be better, because quote unquote, you get what you pay for. Or are you saying that you
I'm
don't
saying that there is no technical business reason for these mounts to be so expensive. They're only so expensive because we continue paying for them.
Okay.
All right, I have I have a $6,500 tangentator here right now, and I know why it costs that much money.
Yeah.
I cannot make that scope for $2,000.
Correct.
Okay. Now, to be fair, there are, if you want beautiful designs and a lot of other things, there are mounts over there that give you that. I'm saying from a technical engineering standpoint, these can be made for reasonable money with a profit for the manufacturer.
So would you say that when you're paying more for a mount, it's not necessarily that it's getting you a better engineered mount, but rather it might be a nicer finish, like a prettier mount? Like, so a little bit more.
So there is a difference. So there are a lot of mounts on the market that are well designed and badly engineered.
Okay.
I'll cover that in a moment. It's not necessarily even a better finish. They look prettier. They look more interesting. There are quite a few mounts out there that I'm convinced look the way they do just to make them look different for marketing purposes. That costs money, right?
Okay.
Okay, going through the comments so that I'm not too far behind. Was the plastic bearing spherical? I assumed we're talking about burr signature rings.
Mhm.
So on the side contacting the scope, it's obviously flat. On the side contacting the rings, it was basically a curved surface, so you could adjust for misalignments. Okay. All right, that's an interesting question from Mr. the Clown. So what is this optical zero that I keep on hearing about on the Arkin page? People are saying they're running out of windage when sighted in their Arkins and are utilizing Arkin rings. I have no clue because honestly, I haven't spent a lot of time looking at the Arkin webpage. So I really don't know. Optical zero has a meaning, but rifle scope companies usually don't know what it is. So, I mean, I know it sounds bad, but marketing people at rifle scope companies usually don't know what it is. I think that's probably a better way of saying this. So I don't know what is meant here. For rifle scopes, there is optical zero and there is mechanical. The optical zero, so there are three subsystems in a rifle scope. There is the objective, that's on this side. It's basically, this is a sunshade. From here to the turret, roughly, that's the objective. From the turrets to the eyepiece, that's the erector. And then there is eyepiece. These are three. If they're all perfectly aligned to each other, center to center, that's your optical zero. The moment you start twisting the turrets, one of them starts moving up, down, left, right? So you're not necessarily at optical zero there. Mechanical zero can be different. Mechanical zero is simply the middle of the travel of the turrets. Okay. But the optical zero is where these three optical systems are perfectly lined up to each other. It doesn't have to be at mechanical zero. It can be set up differently at the factory. What the specific problem with Arkin is, I don't know.
Yeah, and I mean, I have a couple Arkin scopes and Arkin rings, and I haven't run out of adjustment in order to get it sighted in, if that's basically what we're referring to. But I mean, it could obviously be bad scope or out of spec rings or base.
Okay, they suggest returning to optical center and trying again.
It could be people simply as well, not mounting it flush against the front of the Picatinny slot, and they have it slightly angled, and
Yeah,
figure
that's
that
possible.
it's going to turn it to the right or the left if they're not mounting it properly.
There's
stuff like that.
there's a variety of ways it can be screwed up without knowing the details. I don't know what to tell you. Returning it to optical center is actually not such a straightforward thing. You can get close if you take your scope, put it up against the mirror, and while looking at it, start twisting the turrets, and so the reflection of the reticle is superimposed on the reticle itself. That assumes the front of the scope is machined square. It usually is not perfectly square, but it'll get you very close to the optical center. You're basically making an autocollimate out of the rifle scope. But generally speaking, you in the field without somewhat specialized equipment, you cannot return it to optical zero. You don't know where it is. You can return it to the mechanical zero. You can only return it to an optical zero by accident. All right. Okay. Sorry, guys, I'm blowing through this quickly. If you want to chime in on anything, tell me. I'm not a mechanical engineer.
Quickly.
But then this is quickly for me. But in circuit card manufacturing, we use statistical process control. Aren't scope mount manufacturers using SPC in their process? Some are, some aren't, depending how big they are. Big ones certainly are. Small ones certainly aren't.
Okay. And since Ilya is taking his time and answering all your questions, if you want to help support his live stream, make sure you become either a member of his locals page or send a super chat and let him know that you appreciate what he's doing.
So
and
now
then
you know who is the engineer, who is the businessman.
And then you can hop over on all of our pages and definitely say thanks. It's a tight-knit community. We support each other, we love each other, and we definitely all need to be in this together.
Yes.
And that's that. And yes,
So-
he's the engineer. I'm the
marketing. I'm the shooter.
I'm not even an engineer. I'm technically a
And
physicist.
Bullets for
he's
Bucks
the
is the
brains.
hunter.
I'm the beauty.
I'm the brains. He's the delusion.
And and that guy eats bear balls. I'm sorry. He's Mr. 1.4 million views every 48 hours because he works his ass off and he hustles.
Actually, I think I'm going to hit 2 million.
Okay. So here's actually a good question. And I want to hear what you guys think about it. American Rifle Company scope rings. I do have the Embrace mount, and I'm very well familiar with them. And I was going to talk about these as an example of a very specific phenomenon.
Didn't we talk
but I'm
about
curious
this?
what your take on them is.
I could have sworn we talked about their arc rings
Mhm.
at one of the shows. So these are the ones that have the openings at the top, I
Okay.
believe, right?
Yes. So
Or if
I'm
you
going
wanna
to
put- or
go
if you
on
wanna pull up
the
a picture.
web page, and I'm going to put it on the screen. This is actually very
I
worthwhile.
know I talked to Aaron from Anarchy Outdoors about these because he uses them on his NRL 22 plus his RPR 6 Creed that he uses.
Yeah, I've never used them. I've played with a couple on the guns that I've
I
shot.
found them.
Are
I'm
they,
going
are they horizontal mounting or vertical mounting? Like, because
No, so they sit
You'll
in.
see in a moment.
They sit in, and there's like one bolt that tightens the whole thing, but it uses like a ridiculous amount of inch pounds. And you would think
65.
you would think it would break the scope, but it doesn't.
Yeah, no, that doesn't break the scope. So here's what they look like.
yeah.
Okay.
I've seen.
So
I've
there
seen
is
them.
like a base on the bottom. Then there are 2 hinges on the sides. So the ring is not 2 halves. It's basically 3 pieces: base and 2 quarter length pieces. And there is 1 bolt at the top that's quite beefy. And you just tighten that. What are your thoughts, guys?
I want to try them. I haven't tried them yet.
I defer to
Steven?
your judgment.
I don't like the idea of a hinge, to be honest, but that's just based on like a gut feeling. Like I don't like the idea of having a hinge with a pin going through it on something that I want rock solid.
Okay.
Well, I can tell you right now, these are really popular in PRS. I've seen them used down here a lot in the Southwest.
But the question is this a solution in search of a problem?
Is it a problem
Anything
in search of a
else?
solution? Who knows?
I do want to know what your take is though on vertical mount, like vertical rings that tighten this way.
That's what,
Oh, I
we're
hate
talking
those
about that.
things.
So let's talk about that next. I'm going to talk about these a little bit. So they're very popular in the PRS world, but honestly, so are spur mounts, and those actually have technical problems.
Right.
That's just so you were not here in the beginning. I basically said most rings with most scopes for most conditions work just fine. When I say we're trying to play the odds, we're trying to basically minimize the probability of ending up in a situation where you have a total stack up and harsh conditions, because that's when stuff starts failing.
Right. So the rifle you see behind me, I actually am running the Sunway photo rings on here that were sent to me that I'm giving a try. This is a rifle I set up for my son that he's going to be using for NRL and PRS this year. Well, the rest of this year and next year, that we're giving these rings a try. We're going to put them through their test. And
What's the name of the company again?
Sunway Photo.
There's new ones
Sunway
coming
Photo.
out.
Oh yeah, I'm somewhat familiar with those.
But we're also doing a lot of the thing is with this rifle, we're also doing a lot of barrel testing on this barrel. couple different barrels that we're doing. I've gotten into more technical aspects of stuff lately. So we're giving things new things a try. We're going to give them a run because I've come into the thing with a lot of people wanting to get into PRS. They can't afford a $150 set of rings or $200 set of rings right away. I mean, you can always upgrade later, but I was like, well, I got a solution here. Let me see if these work, and we'll go from there.
Yeah. So Sunway photo rings, I don't know which generation you have. The original ones with decent.
Yes, the original ones.
Yeah,
original.
Decent. They will work most of the time. There are a couple of problems that can manifest themselves. Not necessarily will, but can. The second generation stuff will be much better. Call it a hunch.
I don't know shit, but hey, I'm just a white guy here. That's where the Dark Lord of Optics shirt. Hey, we're all having fun.
I see. Before you answer the vertical sandwiching rings, as I refer to them, there is a super chat. I don't know if you want to hit that before.
You have a sizable super chat.
Oh, well, there we go. Mr. Ian Hutchinson. Okay. I'm going to answer the super chat first, then we'll go back to American Rifle Company, and then we'll do the vertical rings. Mr. Ian Hutchinson, well, thank you for your support. I've got a question for you, looking for a place to ask it. Do prescription glasses looking through a rifle scope at an oblique angle affect parallax? Or what other considerations? Not sure where to ask. So they should not affect parallax too much, but they can. Basically, what happens is that if you are, so here's eyeglasses for you. If you look carefully at the lens, you will notice that the thickness of the lens is different in different parts. And all the eyeglasses are designed so that you're primarily looking through the center. If you've turned your head like this and you're looking a little bit through the edge, how they correct for your vision changes slightly. You're looking through a little bit more glass, the angles change a little bit. And what will happen is that if you adjusted the eyepiece of the rifle scope while looking straight through it, when you turn your head and you're looking through the edge of the lens, that eyepiece adjustment may not be perfect. And if the eyepiece adjustment is not perfect, then it can induce a parallax effect. Remember the way a rifle scope works. So we have a reticle that's right under the turrets usually. We adjust sight focus to get the image focused on the reticle. We adjust the eyepiece to get your eye focused on the reticle. When both the target is focused on the reticle and the eye are focused on the reticle, you have no parallax. If one of them is not focused on the reticle of the edge, then you can start having parallax issues. On the other hand, unless you have very, very severe nearsighted or farsighted, but basically unless you have very, very high prescription, generally the shift in eyepiece setting between the center of the lens and the edge of the lens is not going to be very severe. Good. Does this make sense?
Now, would that change if somebody was more blind? So let's say, for example, instead of like -1, -2, they might be a -6 or 7, like they're like wearing those like very thick glasses.
Yes, the change is going to be a little bit big. These are -4.5.
Okay.
So, and it's a difference.
And would it, like, if somebody's like that, would it possibly make a difference if they're wearing contacts?
No, contacts, no. Contacts, when you look over, your eyeball shifts. You're always looking through the same part of the contact.
Okay.
So normally I wear contacts. That's one of the many reasons.
All right. And your comment started a who's the most blind. So we have Mr. Sundin at I'm -9.
Yeah, -9 is significant. Anyhow, Ian, I hope that answers your question. I wouldn't worry about it too much, but if you have time, you can explore this. Just shift your head and see what happens. But before you do that, you want to have the eyepiece and the sight focus perfectly set up.
Okay. And actually, so while on that same line, would the design of the eyepiece on the scope itself play with anything on there, or the fast focus eyepiece is generally going to be fairly easy, and it's an easy thing to get right on scopes, that it's not necessarily going to be an issue with the quality of the scope that somebody's looking for?
For most mid-range and better rifle scopes today, the eyepieces are usually good enough.
Okay.
you can have a little bit more problem with scopes that are very wide angle, because again, the cone of light coming into your eye is going to be wider. Wide angle is generally a good thing, but it can play a little bit weirdly with eyeglasses.
Actually, Ian's got a second part to his question, and I would like to answer this one.
Ian's question?
Yeah, so Ian just put a follow-up at the very last comment.
Oh, there you go. I see it. Styles of glasses make a difference. More concerned about prone versus standing, vertical differential versus lateral. Okay. Derek?
Yeah, actually, yes. The different styles of glasses will make a difference. Like, as you guys can see here, I'm wearing more of a oblong style. When I'm shooting matches and stuff like that, I'm wearing like a wraparound Oakleys, just because that way I don't have that issue. Because the problem I have with these when I'm shooting prone is that I'm actually looking over the glasses, so half it's I can see half of it perfect and half of it not. So yes, the style of glasses do make a big difference. I recommend going to something like an Oakley's or some sort of like a good shooting glasses that will wrap around your whole eyes.
Jerry Mechallicker, wasn't that his name? They wear like really big glasses.
So yes, the style of glasses do make a big difference in how you have them sit in height on your face, especially when you're shooting bigger guns prone.
Okay. Good comment. So generally speaking, the potential induced parallax is a function of how far off center you are. That's basically it. If you have a smaller lens like Derek's glasses or mine here, if I set up a probe, I start looking over them because the lens is just not big enough. Mm-hmm. You could have just a larger lens glasses like Oakley's or a few others. There's several. I have other glasses that are much larger. And how much parallax you can induce basically depends on how far off center you are. Whether it's vertical or horizontal doesn't really matter too much. It's just how far off center you are. Okay. All right. So arc rings. Steven said that according to his instincts, the hinge worries him a little bit.
Okay, and
Steven has good instincts.
And I remember now we were having a conversation. I believe it was actually at Comp Expo when we were discussing it. Mm-hmm. And if I'm not mistaken, it was due to the way the angles where the screws were. It was putting the pressures at the wrong angles, and the forces were not equal on both sides of the ring, or something along those lines.
That's vertical rings, not the American company.
All right.
So most of these work well. People like them because it's only one screw. So mounting the scope is very easy. People who swap scopes all the time, like me, it's actually very convenient. Is it a good idea? No. So before that, you had 2 pieces, 2 ring halves to hold tolerance on. Now you have 3 pieces and 2 hinges. Okay. Most of the time, it's going to work. I've heard of several cases where in cold weather, the whole damn thing cracked because it's tightened to 65 pounds, and the
wow.
and the hinge pin is steel. The actual ring material is aluminum. When it gets really cold, they contract at different rates. Steel is not very compressible. How many times has that happened? He probably sold hundreds, if not thousands, of rings, and that I know of, it happened 2 or 3 times. Okay, is it a big problem? No. He holds good tolerances that generally in spec. Vast majority of the time they will work just fine. But the biggest reason they sell is that they look different.
Okay. Well, what I would also say is I know, like with a lot of the brands, so now that I handle marketing for 1.5-ish gun companies, and having come from the competition circles, I mean, you take a look at, I guess like the best example of this is the CZ. So when you look at CZ and you look at any USPSA match, you go to USPSA match and pretty much everyone is a copycat. Half the people at a nationals match, so out of a pool of 400 shooters, half of them are going to be shooting a CZ or a CZ clone. So 50% market share. Meanwhile, you get outside of USPSA and you get outside of that world, and CZ's biggest problem is they can barely crack 0.5% in the broader market share. So I would say I know a lot of the companies that I follow, it's like they have like this cultish following within a small field, whether it's a PRS or NRL Hunter or F class. But then outside of that, it's like, oh, I've never heard of you. Who are you? And what is this? So I think that, I know ARC has had that. I mean, they've been deeply involved in the competitive shooting circle. So that's why I'm not surprised they've sold as much as they have. But I mean, like, I would say the vast majority of regular shooters have probably never heard of them.
Because it's a solution looking for a problem, and that can induce another problem.
Yeah.
But once again, I have the Embrace mount. It works very well.
Yeah.
I bought it because they have this accessory interface. It's very clever. The rings themselves do absolutely nothing for me. Yes, they are. It's easier to mount a scope. Aside from that, they look different. And from a marketing standpoint, being able to stand out from the crowd really helps you, especially in a high-end world where you just spend the $5,000 on a rifle and $4,000 on a scope, and you just want those rings to be cool. And spending another $300-400 is not going to bug you all that much.
But frankly speaking, I mean, outside of this niche world of like uber high-end optics and competitive circles, I mean, what's the average price point for somebody going out and buying a set of rings or buying a set of mount? I mean, is it really going to be like the higher end Burris, let's say Burris XTR rings, like the higher end Vortex ones, or is it going to be the Amazon special for $15 and $20 or whatever, or whatever's included on the scope that they bought at the gun store?
So I do not know what the statistics are.
Okay.
But I do know that enough of the Amazon special rings fail spectacularly, that a lot of people are willing to pay a little bit more. If you want to, I have not done the market research. If I were to make an educated guess, look at how carefully Vortex is trying to push their Vortex Pro rings. They're US made, they are moderately priced. They are actually very good quality.
And they are.
And they are at around, what, $60, $70, something like that?
$80.
So
my local store has
Pro
them for $100.
rings are at about $50. I have a very strong suspicion that $50 to $80 is a tolerable level of pain for people who buy the rings.
I think Vortex actually has had a cheaper, like $30 set for years, kind of flying under the radar. That actually I've used quite a few of them, especially when I was first starting out, and they work fine. They're just huge and bulky, generally speaking.
Correct.
Heavy. I think from seeing sales data from Amazon on lots of rings, I think that most people, there's certainly a number of people that buy super ultra cheap rings, but I think a lot of people buy rings between the $30 and $60 range.
Yeah.
I think that those $30 rings, though, are in the last 3 years are getting closer to like 50 anyway, because the price of everything's going up. But that 30 to 60, maybe $80. I think you get above 60 though, and people kind of, I don't want to spend that much on a set of rings because they're not competitive shooters. They don't have a lot of money. Maybe they're just weekend hunters or weekend recreationists.
You talk about
they don't understand the difference. Yeah.
Yeah. These are actually not great. They are. There is the same OEM that did them for a ton of people. They have a couple of flaws, but they've been making them for a long time in huge quantities and consistently enough, where if your application is not stressful, they work okay.
I think the biggest problem with those, in my opinion, is the bolt that holds on to the Picatinny rail can be stripped out if you over torque it relatively easily, and it
is somewhat soft metal, and there are also a couple of reasons with how they machined a couple of problems with how they machined the ring caps. And Burris had these Vortexes, WFA, and several other people. One step up to the Pro rings, those are actually designed well. Okay, and my best guess is that that's roughly, like as we just discussed, that's the tolerable level of pain. Right? There are people who will buy $10 rings to use with their $150 scopes, And except for a few specific cases, most of these people will mount the scope on the rifle, shoot once a year at the shooting range, and never do anything else with them. So I promised to talk about the vertically split rings. And this one gets kind of this one gets interesting. It gets interesting in that, in principle, if well made, well designed, and well manufactured, there is no real problem, no real difference between vertically split or horizontally split rings from the standpoint of durability and all that sort of stuff. However, historically, vertically split rings were badly engineered. And they were badly engineered, and this is arguably, this next segment is arguably going to be the most important that I'm going to say today from a technical standpoint. Most vertically split rings were badly engineered because the way they worked, they counted on the ring halves deforming as you tighten them. That is a terrible idea. In a high quality, well-made ring, you do not want anything deforming. You want to make it as close to perfectly rounded, perfectly sized as possible, and you want to make the ring halves stiff to the point where they clamp on the scope and the scope doesn't deform and the rings don't deform. This is what you're looking for. If the rings are made like two springs, that way to get a reasonable clamping, you have to tighten them and deform them. While they're deforming, that means they're squeezing the scope, in case of vertical rings, from two sides. But you can have the same problem with horizontal rings that they're made. And depending on where in a scope body you are, you can be deforming the tube to bind things substantially. With vertically split rings, so on the front of the scope, on the scope, there are two spots where you don't want to be doing all this deformation. In the front, on a side focus scope, it's usually right in front of the turret, although it can vary. That's where the focus cell is.
For the sake to show this a little bit better, can you make yourself bigger so you can make yourself full screen to show this?
Usually people tell me that I need to lose weight, not make myself bigger, but okay.
That's why it's a headshot.
That can mean a lot of things, and I don't do those. But okay.
You have a sick mind.
You have no idea. I only let 2% of it out to play.
My man. That's awesome.
Yeah, that's so anyhow, right in front of the turrets, inside here on the side focus scope, there is something called the focus cell that moves front to back. That's what gives you this parallax focus adjustment. You do not want to bind this. And in the back, right in front of the eyepiece, usually where the erector system is mounted, is like a gimbal point. When the erector moves, it's pivoted here. You don't want to squeeze that. The exact locations of all that stuff vary a little bit for different scopes, so you don't know for sure where it is. You shouldn't be pitching it. So the right way to approach this is to not pinch anything. Okay? And the basic problem with traditional vertical split rings was that they relied on deformation. How do you know, as a consumer, how do you know that scope ring halves are stiff enough? Very simple. If everything is reasonably well machined, you pop them on a scope, and from completely loose to properly torqued, and everybody should own a torque wrench. I use mostly fixed sticks, but there are a few. From completely loose to perfectly torqued, there should not be much revolution. It should be within a quarter to half turn, as little as possible. Because if it's more than that, you're bending something. And if you're bending the rings, you're also bending the scope tube, and you don't know what else it's affecting.
I'm sure this is a question on top of everyone's mind, and since you brought it up, what's a proper torque spec? Is there a proper torque spec for the rings or not?
So the rifle scope manufacturer and the ring manufacturer will usually give you different torque specs. The rifle scope manufacturer torque spec is usually going to be lower because the ring manufacturer only cares that the scope doesn't slip. If it's fucking something else up, they don't care. It's going to be scope manufacturer's problem. So go with what the scope manufacturer tells you. The exact torque varies a little bit for different rings, how many screws you have, etc. Around 18 inch-pounds is pretty common, sometimes 20, sometimes 15. Depends if you have 4 screws or 6. But torque is always on dry screws, no Loctite. If you have a torque wrench and you're doing it correctly, there's no reason to put Loctite on scope cap screws.
So you mentioned the arc rings, and you mentioned that it was a 65 inch-pound.
Yeah.
Why is there such a discrepancy between that, or is it
Because
it's
there the
simply one-
angles are different, right? So he's got
Okay.
these 2 hinges, and those are not moving in and out. So
Mhm.
he's on tightening one screw on top that's above the scope tube.
Okay.
So the way it translates into clamping power is a little bit different.
Okay.
Can we talk about the monster in the room with these? So this is the vertical mounting. This style, it not only the same screw, the screws down here mounted.
Yeah,
to
those are the worn rings, yes.
And hold down the bottom, the top. So I don't really like that, like from a mechanical standpoint. But
yeah, that's not
the
a
biggest
good
thing is swapping the scope from gun to gun. If you do that a lot, is you have to like re-level the scope every time, because this is going to loosen everything up every time you take it off.
every
Oh,
time.
it's
It
a
is a
nightmare.
huge pain in the ass.
So I hate saying this because I like the guys that worn scope mounts. They're good people. Worn vertical rings, don't use them. I have quite a few. I've used them on a permanently mounted application where I'm not going to be dialing the turrets, where I've had a chance to test it out. Yeah, you can make them work. I've made many of them work. I used to recommend them before I thought about it a little bit. Not a good idea. Worn horizontally split rings, especially from the higher end line, are very, very good. The vertically split stuff, with the one that Steven showed, let me make you bigger if I can. How do I make you bigger?
Yep.
There you go. Okay, stop. Hold it like this. So notice that, so there are 2 rings up top and 2 rings in the bottom. And on the bottom of the scope tube, thank you for that, on the bottom of the scope tube, there is this little hinge point. So when you're tightening the bottom 2 screws to clamp this thing on the base, you're opening the ring halves up top. And because all this stuff is designed to bend, you basically are going back and forth and trying to make sure this thing works, and half the time it'll slide and wobble within the cross slots anyway. It's just not a great idea.
That's stupid.
Interestingly, Warren made a version of these rings that work quick detach, where they fixed this counterbalancing problem, but the ring halves was still deforming. So, thank you for that, Stephen. Much appreciated. Yeah. Okay. So that's the business. Just to finish real quick. However, you can make vertically split rings that are perfectly stiff with reasonably thick cross sections that will work just fine. Nobody does it, but it's absolutely possible. Okay. So, anything else you guys want to chime in with? Anything else you should cover before we look at the comments again?
I absolutely hate those rings.
There we go.
Yeah, that's why it's a paperweight. I think I am curious. I imagine, and this is kind of maybe stupid, but I imagine you use Loctite on your scope base to receiver. What about like ring to scope base? Or I know you said you don't use it on the top, like when you're mounting the ring on the scope. What are your take?
Partly because like you need to torque them down to evenly distribute this whole thing, and with Loctite it becomes hard, and if properly torqued, they just don't become loose. The rings between the scope base and the receiver, those you should use Loctite on, and it's primarily because there the exact torque spec is not as critical as long as you don't strip anything, but there's a lot of vibration coming through the receiver, so you don't need any sort of a crazy Loctite, blue Loctite or Vibratite. Any of those works. You just don't want all that stuff to loosen due to vibration.
And then so when I've been in a hurry from time to time, I will admit, and knowingly that it wasn't the best thing to do, but put Loctite in the hole and then put the screw in. I know but I don't know that. I know there's like a technical reason why you should put on the threads and then put it in the hole. Is that correct?
It doesn't
What-
matter
you
as
know-
long as it gets in the thread somehow. It really makes no difference.
Because somebody said it could like hydraulically lock it if you put it in the hole first. I know it can push the Loctite maybe more through into your receiver, getting gunk in there. But what's your take on that? I mean, people split.
Some people just overcomplicate their life.
Okay.
And coming
want
from me, I know it sounds weird, right? But
Hey, we ain't judging. We ain't judging.
speak for yourself. I see Mr. Slavguns over there. He's judging.
He's got like that 1-inch sensor camera, the high quality audio. Look at the lighting on that.
I'm sorry.
place.
I'm sorry.
Mona
Don't
Lisa.
insult me with 1-inch sensors. All I have are full frame cameras, and tomorrow I'm picking up another 8K camera.
Oh my
So
gosh!
You're looking at me actually through a 1-inch sensor, so I'm compensating.
You are like a snob, so
yes. Well,
right
my
now,
Leica doesn't have direct video out, but the next one I get will.
My lens is certified by Leica. It's a cheap Panasonic.
They're actually nice lenses. But anyhow,
I'm using a $30 webcam from Amazon. I mean, I ain't gonna bitch. It works.
Yeah, there we go.
It's done really well the last 3 years.
On the hydraulic this or that, Stephen, don't pay too much attention to it. So as long as the Loctite gets it on the screw, gets in on the screws, you're fine. A very simple way to work through all of this nonsense, and it's generally not a bad idea with screws, especially with the screws that connect the base to the receiver and the screws that connect the ring to the base. I always, and one of the reasons I don't have too many problems with this, what I do with those is that I will tighten it and I will loosen it. I will tighten it and I will loosen it. I will do this 3 or 4 times before I do the final tightening with the torque wrench.
Maybe I'm confused or miss it. Do you lactate? A Loctite.
I don't lactate very much.
He doesn't lactate.
Do you Loctite?
I mean, I look like I could, but I don't.
The base, like on a ring that goes onto a Picatinny base, like a 20 amp. Do you Loctite the base to the ring to the base?
I usually don't.
Okay.
But whether you Loctite it or not, a very good way of doing this is to tighten it, loosen it, do this a few times to get all the bearing surfaces to sit.
Okay.
So the way the ring mates to the base appears to be, I've been doing a lot of digging into this, talking to a lot of people, doing some experimentation, appears to be one of the main reasons for the point of impact shift due to lateral impact. There are a few other different rules of thumbs we'll talk about in a moment. I'm going to be kind of throwing these things at you a little at a time. I just don't want all the comments to become too stale. Because somebody can ask a comment, and if I get to it 45 minutes later, they'll be gone. So
that's why I'll actually guide you. So you have a couple of questions on them. The first one on the topic of vertical rings. So Fire Prank, he says, with vertical rings, I'm usually thinking about how the ADM LaRue mounts have the base separate from the ring half, so it ends up being 3 pieces per ring. And then Bill Goring, he had a question about Night Force Extreme Duty rings. Are they overpriced?
So let's see. For the ADM LaRue, I'll talk about that in a moment. I don't use anything from LaRue ADM that's vertically split for a variety of reasons, partly because it's a perfect example of nice design, bad engineering. For the Night Force Extreme rings, yes, they're overpriced. They're good rings, but they're very expensive for no good reason other than Night Force name, and they need the profit margins.
Okay, there you go.
All right, going a little further back, I kind of went to the last question I did not address. Thoughts on height of a bore, mount the optic as low as possible, focus on comfort ergonomics. I think we touched on that a little bit. I don't know about you guys. For me, it's basically comfort ergonomics. All that needs to be set up to how I interact with the rifle. How the scope interacts with the rifle in absence of the shooter is completely irrelevant.
Yeah, and plus, I mean, right now with any modern ballistic software, you can absolutely adjust for height of a bore, so that's really practically not going to make any difference. And I think Derek can probably chime in on this. So I know, like, even the traditional methodology, like for hunting markets, okay, you want to get the scope as close to the bore as possible. I know I watch a lot of videos from F-class, and there the scopes are like really high off, and then like because they want to basically keep the scope higher off of the barrel, so then you're going to have less mirage. and all
Correct.
those issues. But with, I think, whether you're using Hornady 4DOF app or Strellock Pro or
Use applied
like
ballistics.
Kestrel.
Use something that works.
Yeah, like Kestrel. If you use
So
Kestrel, it'll
I use
adjust for
your
it.
ballistics most of the time. It works very well. I just started using the new Element one. They actually are doing a very, very good job with it.
I'm working on that one right now. I'm using it as a backup.
Yeah, it's actually
I
quite
will-
good. FX has their own same ballistic engine as Element. That works nicely. But
I will-
Slav guns is. Do you want me to call you Slav guns or Max? What do you prefer?
Whatever.
All right, Max is shorter. So Max is right.
He just freaking doxed me. Can you believe that? No, I think by now most people know me.
Yes, I have his address. It's going to be in the video description.
Well, she wasn't a Russian.
Don't you dare! Don't you dare!
No
You know-
worries. You have small kids. I respect the children.
Do you know how
personally?
crazy
Not so
some
much.
people are? So it's bad enough I go to some local stores that know me. Like one of the stores loves the fact that they have a YouTuber that comes in locally, and I'm standing there at the counter one day, and like this guy comes in like, "Oh my god, it's you!" I'm like, "What the fuck?" And like that was like the only scary. That was my first like scary fan sighting that like people put people up on pedestal. But I digress.
Pedestal
You
not
must be
so
a
much, but every once in a
sorry.
while somebody
People
will
are
approach
weird.
gun store
I mean, like,
or somewhere.
I mean-
Are you the Dark Lord? I go, yes, I am.
Now I'm gonna suck. Now turn around. I'm gonna suck your blood.
thought you were gonna say something.
Genuinely
Yeah.
turning around and play something else. I don't believe one of those, but okay.
I'm sure. Yes, I'm the Dark Lord, and I like my headshots.
I've had more problems with low. I shouldn't say a lot of problems. I feel like if you have a scope high, I've never had ergonomic issues that really bothered me, but I've actually had scopes so low, and the stock was designed with like a cheek rise built into it, that I actually felt super uncomfortable, and it like hurt my neck, and it was hard to even see because I'm so like this when I'm prone. I'm like practically dying trying to look through it because it's so low over bore. So from an ergonomic standpoint, I've never had a problem high. I've had more problems when it's been extremely low on some rifles. When I'm shooting, especially shooting uphill with a hunting rifle, and you're really low, you can actually really have a hard time getting down in there. So
the whole business with mounting the scope as low as possible started when most rifles still had iron sights, so the stocks had a lot of drop in them. And that's why people are trying to mount scopes low. Don't do that. Fit the stock so that all of us are built differently. The interaction between your shoulder and your head is a little bit different for everyone. Build up your stock of the rifle so that is comfortable. The single biggest reason. Well, give me one short second.
Go.
Yeah, single biggest reason why people frequently shoot the first two shots well and then start pulling shots all over the place is the undue stress on their neck. That will absolutely screw up your shooting. Okay, you want your head and neck and shoulder to be as comfortable, relaxed of a position as possible. It's never going to be perfect. It's kind of a backwards, weird ass position, but you want to minimize the stress on your neck. It affects your inner ear. It affects your sense of balance. You'll start pulling shots.
And I think really it's going to come down to is like, don't contort yourself around the gun. Bring the gun and make the gun and the chassis work with you, and that's why you can get a stock with adjustable length of pull.
Steven, isn't it nice to hear this from people who don't hunt? Ever tried to take a shot from at an elk from 300 something yards, looking up into the sun, hiding behind the bush, so that your body has to simultaneously go through 48 different angles while balancing on single toe?
pretty much. Or you just, if you can, you can just hold your hand over the end of the objective and try to guard the sun, and or put your hat over it. I've done all kinds of
get a choice, but when you have a choice, so Max is absolutely right. Don't contort yourself to the gun. Set it up so that it's as comfortable to shoot as possible.
So actually, the only thing that comes to my mind when it comes to having the scope as close to the bore as possible would be if, once again, we're talking about a hunting situation for point blank range. So if you just have your scope mounted and you know you have it zeroed for whatever distance, And now it's going to be good enough for anything between 50 yards to 300 yards that you don't need to make any adjustments. And by having it higher off of the scope, that would mess with the point blank range.
Very, very little. For hunting
Very
purposes,
little.
doesn't matter.
Okay.
You're
So this
talking
height
about a
of
couple inches. I mean,
Okay.
if that.
Okay,
I mean,
here's the thing. It really depends on what kind of a stock you're using. If you're using a hybrid, a regular, or a chassis, is going to make the big difference on how you set up your scope, your eye relief, and how you're going to, and what kind of range you're using. Makes a big difference because, quite honestly, every one of them is going to fit different. If I went from chassis back to stocks for PRS, I just could not get comfortable with the chassis enough to where I was actually making progress with it.
There you go.
So I went back to a stock, which I shoot mainly with the MDT XRSs, which is a phenomenal hybrid system for the price. Next year, I've actually got a Macmillan MC3 over here set up. So honestly, when it comes to a stock, is it more of a traditional style hunting stock where you have a really deep non-vertical grip, or is it more of a vertical grip where that stock and the grip are going to be even with each other? Is going to make a big difference in what you're using for that fact. Because honestly, you got to find what sets up and works for you. And I tell this to everybody who gets into PRS. I've got 2 or 3 people I'm coaching right now, and I tell them, hey, you got to see what works for you. If you want to try a chassis, I've got 2 chassis guns over here. Let's go to the range. Let's grab 20 rounds. Let's see what you shoot better. I'm going to put you on a bench. I'm going to put you prone. I'm going to put you off of a barrier. And this is going to tell you what you're going to be able to shoot better. And we'll analyze the data, the groups, and everything for that. Some people can shoot chassis really well and can manipulate them. Some people are more of a stock person where everything has to be set up high, and then it just works better for them. It's more of a natural feel. So I don't know if that helps you guys at all, but that's the way I look at things because every stock is different. And every chassis is different, and and one thing I can agree with Ilya is everybody has a different shoulder pocket set up on their body, and the way you can move your neck and you can't move your neck or your elbow, your wrist. So you really got to find what's going to work for you and what does and doesn't work. If that makes any sense to you guys.
It makes sense. You're absolutely correct. If you shoot long enough and you shoot enough, you will find certain commonalities, certain things that work well for you. In others, I shoot both chassis and conventionally stock guns, but with conventionally stock guns, I still prefer somewhat vertical grip. I use Macmillan's Game Scout. It has fairly slim forend but fairly vertical grip, for example, and that works very well for me.
Right.
I think one of the important things to know if you're newer to shooting though is to gather like legitimate data on what you should do, but not like opinion, which is hard to discern because there's so much. Like when I got into it, it was literally like as close to the board as you can get, and so that's how I ended up with maybe that one gun where I could barely look through the scope, especially in certain shooting positions, because everybody preached it, and you were harassed if you didn't do it. And it's like that's opinion and feelings. You gotta like cancel that out and go with true data and then what is comfortable for you. And I think a lot of it is shooting position. One thing you got to remember though is especially if it's a hunting rifle and you never know what angle or what position, and certainly some PRS as well, is you can never put your head lower necessarily if you're going to hit, cheek out on the stock, but you can always put it higher generally. Okay. And so that's something to take note of.
Yeah, it's a good point.
I'll say the reason why I got rid of chassis and I went to stocks was because up north, a lot of us were shooting having to put our rifle under the barricade. And when you're shooting a chassis, you're digging it down into the ground to get low enough to get up underneath there. And at least with the stock, I didn't have to. I could slide it right in and just throw a rear bag in there and go to town with it. And I agree with you. Sometimes you don't have the option there at whatever time and decision, but I tell everybody, even my son who's now getting into PRS with me, I tell him every night, hey, if you want, grab a bag, grab a chair, grab a rifle, throw the bag on, get ready, and get yourself into a fixed position, and just do this. And now my son's a big game hunter. He's gotten a deer about a year and a half ago. He just got himself a bear a couple months ago. He's going out hunting back up in Idaho in October. He's got a lot more fundamentals than most kids his age that do this, and even more than some adults, to be honest with you, from what I've seen, working retail in the gun industry from a day-to-day perspective.
Very cool.
All right. So there's a great question that you skipped. I would love your answer on, because I mean, like this, I'm sure this is on top of everyone's mind. Can you safely carry a rifle by the scope?
Where was it?
It was right after the American Rifle Company scope rings. Tony
There we go. That's actually a good question. So let's address this one. Oh, you know what? I'm going to put you guys on the spot. What do you think?
Carry it? No. Pick it up. I've done it with mine. I've never had an issue, especially at a PRS match where you got to lift yourself up, grab your rifle, and if you can't grab from underneath it, sometimes I'll grab the top of the scope. I've never had an issue.
I do.
Steven?
Go ahead, Max, if you want.
I try to do that very, very seldom, and it's only, let's say, for example, if I need to carry 2 rifles without cases, but I feel very dirty doing it. I feel like I'm putting like undue pressures or not. I think like there was a Coltec or somebody makes those carry holsters that carry and like they kind of cradle the entire scope.
Take Home HQ.
Okay.
You guys could do structured barrels. They also make the cage.
Yeah. I try not to, but like, I mean, it was always like on top of my mind. I believe I was reading something that can possibly put undue pressures on something. Yeah.
Anything's a possibility, to be honest with you.
So, Steven?
I actually am going to go with, I don't think there's any problem in it, at least with rifles that are under 15 pounds, we'll say. I think that the bigger concern I would have, and I don't typically do it. I do it from time to time with light hunting rifles, certainly, but not a lot. I think my biggest concern is actually with like a non-locking turret is your hand. If you were in a hunting situation, could brush the turret, knock it off zero. You're gonna get adrenaline rush. You're going to make a shot, not realize you're zero. Your turret might have turned if you're using tactical turrets. But I think, who's the guy that you guys all know him? I can't remember. Was it Pete or whatever? The guy in South Africa?
Pete Malone from Impact Shooting.
They did an entire, I'm pretty sure like a month ago, they did an entire test and an entire in-depth video on this and said it was fine to carry by the scope. But I don't know, but that I think was a practical more, it's not like an engineer standpoint. It's
actually,
like
what I'm thinking, putting thought on this right now, correct me if I'm wrong, it's not necessarily going to be the issue in the scope, but the scope is connected to the scope base, and those scope bases are attached by 2 tiny ass screws to the gun itself, and that might cause some issues.
It doesn't unless they lose.
Okay.
All right. Okay. Lots of conjecture. You're mostly correct.
Educate us, our dear Lord.
Dear Supreme Lord. Supreme Dark Lord.
Supreme Dark
Lord. So use the
Lord.
right terminology. So rifle scope.
Yes, Daddy.
Rings. If you pick it up between the rings, if you're trying to get adopted, ain't happening. If you pick it up between the rings like this, you're fine. Just don't mess with it. Don't adjust the turrets. You're okay. Picking it up by the objective when there's a heavy rifle on it, most of the time nothing's going to happen, but it's not advisable. Especially if your front ring is right up by the turrets and you pick it up in front and lift it up. That's a pretty big lever. This is where the objective lens is. This is where the reticle is. If you flex this a little bit, you can actually change your point of aim. If you fix your rifle and press down on the objective with the front ring being way here, you can often see a shift. And then the whole thing springs back exactly where it was. What you want to avoid is a potential situation where it doesn't spring perfectly back. But if you have a vertically split ring that's squeezing something here and then lift it up by the objective, really good chance of something shifting. So can you use the scope as a handle? If it's between the rings, yes. If it's in front of the rings, I mean, you
No.
can, but it's not the best idea.
All right.
So happens I've
Wait.
actually done some experimentation on this.
Do you think that, like what I mentioned to or alluded to earlier, like I wouldn't want to do it with like a 30-pound rifle. I just feel like that would put way more stress on it. I mean, I guess if you're between
heavier rifle will make a difference, but the lighter rifle is obviously less stress in it. But once again, I titled this live stream is "Playing the Odds."
Mhm.
Playing the odds means developing good habits, right? Don't get the habit of carrying the rifle by the objective of rifle scope. At some point you'll forget, and that's going to be exactly the wrong time, and it's going to bite you in the ass, right? So just develop good habits. Make sense?
Yes, it does.
This was a kind of a good question. So if it's thankfully people are doing it less and less. There are a few companies still do these integral proprietary rings and mounts, like Ruger does. Tikka Sako have theirs. I wish they would all stop doing it. Some of them work, some of them don't. Sako has a pretty good idea, but shitty rings.
For the Hawkeye, they do have one-piece bases as well. So the Ruger Hawkeye long-range target, it comes with a big one with the rail. You should be able to get it and replace it, so you don't have to feel stuck.
My basic recommendation is whatever you have. The market's sort of coalescing around the Weaver Picatinny standard. For any of these proprietary mount types, there's I think for all of them, you can go buy a single piece Weaver Picatinny rail that's gonna fit into this proprietary mount, and then you put normal rings on it. The basic problem is that with the Ruger receivers, I've seen quite a few. I've seen quite a few with CZs and a few others, and most of the time they work fine. But Ruger has been making the basic action forever and a day. They were not always of the same quality. You don't know which one you're going to get. But it's again, why experiment with this, right? If you really want to know, go experiment. If you want to go shooting rather than messing with the rifle, minimize your problems, get a single rail, nail it down, shot, and put normal rings on it and be done.
I love my Sako, but it drives me crazy that they offer no models, to my knowledge, with the integral rail, because it's like integral in 20 MOA, and so that drives me crazy. It's like, why not make it 20 MOA if it's going to be integral for those people that want to push it to the limits? I don't know, but I know they kind of cater to European hunters probably.
The problem also that Sako, very uncharacteristically, very good company, their Optilock rings, the metal on them is shit.
Really?
They're too thin, they flex all over the place, screws strip. They paid some high schooler to design those rings.
Well, on my Sako S20, it's got the integral 0 MOA Picatinny rail as part of it. So I just got different. I got regular.
Yeah, that one works fine.
Here's a really silly question. Why are Torx head screws mechanically or whatnot better than Allen head screws? Because I know stuff kind of going towards Torx head. Yes. I imagine there's a reason, but I don't know that reason. What is that reason?
So obviously that person has never worked on his car.
I've worked on cars actually a lot, but
there is. I'll let him answer it.
All right. There are a lot of comments I haven't gotten to yet, so I'll answer it quickly.
Okay.
They're less likely to strip.
Okay.
You can put on more torque, and now there is a next version of Torx Plus, where the shape of those grooves is a little bit different, even
Torx
less likely
Plus?
to strip.
Wow.
I think Plus or Star Plus or something like that.
Well, there's Torx and e-Torx. I didn't know there's like a different Torx. Well, e-Torx is the security one with the
shape
hole.
of those little grooves in the screw head is a little bit different.
All right, I'll look at this. I love Torx.
With a properly fitting key, you're less likely to strip this, so you can apply torque consistently. With the Allen, especially since we have both metric and Imperial, you have a very high chance of getting the Allen key in there that looks like it's correct. It fits in reasonably tight, but it's not quite. Then when you start applying torque, you are stripping shit, and then you don't know how much torque actually went where it's supposed to go and all that sort of stuff. It's just a pain in the ass. Torx doesn't care about Imperial versus metric, and the way it is machined and shaped, you're less likely to be using that torque off of your nice fixer stick into deforming the screw head versus tightening the rings.
Cool.
Okay. So is mount rigidity a concern for lesser recoiling rifles? Can a mount be so spindly it has issues with 3/8 level recoil or less? Yes, I've seen them. It's possible. What is more common on lower recoil stuff, and this is another mount issue that I want to touch on, is that if there are some mounts that are hard to set up properly, and you have more high probability chance of this tolerance stack up. A good example of that is the Spur mount. That's very expensive, and then once again, PRS people love. A friend of mine, I was chatting with him. He goes, "Look, like of all the high-end mounts, and he's seen a lot of them, the only one that ever slipped was a Spur, and it was like on a 16-pound 223." Why did it slip? So Spur, for God knows what reason, uses screws with a conical head. That means that when you tighten things, the screw forces the ring halves to be in a very particular location. And if there is a little bit of a machining issue, now your ring halves did not self-align, did not center on the scope tube. Now they're a little bit like this. And what you're doing, you're scraping the scope, and you don't have a lot of contact surface, stuff can slip. The same thing happens with vertical or horizontally split rings. If you are supposed to tighten them evenly, but the gaps on two sides are very different, you're also creating this asymmetric pressure where you're not going to have very good surface engagement. There are a few screws out there, rings out there, where the two rings on the top that clamp them, they're not vertical, they're like this. So when you're tightening them, the force goes at an angle. And if your ring halves, the gaps are not absolutely perfectly, flawlessly symmetrical, your ring halves are going to be like this. Okay. And again, you put on your torque and everything is fine. The gap is not the same. The angles are weird. This thing is going to slip or bind something or something like that. You're basically putting this lateral shear stress onto the scope tube. I've seen some mounts where they skeletonize them so thoroughly that it has all the rigidity of a wet noodle, but it's not common. You want to be a little bit careful with how you skeletonize stuff. For example, if you have a normal ring, I don't have one here. I don't see one here. You have a normal ring, right? So, and like on that cheap Vortex we saw, in the bottom of the ring, there's a bunch of, there's a big cutout all the way through. It's not going to be rigid enough. If it's partially hollowed out, it may or may not be. If there's a huge hole going through there, it's probably not going to be rigid enough.
Okay. You mean like that hole or a different type?
Yeah, that's a terrible idea. Okay. What happens is that it's somewhat rigid, but a lot of this, if you start applying this torsional stress, the whole thing is going to flex. Guess what happens under recoil? Okay. It's not a great idea. So if you don't hollow it out all the way, if you leave enough material, it's kind of like an I-beam. So it has reasonable stiffness in most axes, but once again, not for flexing, right? Good companies do what's called FA, finite element analysis. It's a nice software. You can analyze all of this and build in enough cross-section volume to not worry about it. The basic problem is that with a million and rifle scope mount companies over there, I have no clue who is doing what kind of analysis.
Yeah.
I have a suspicion that a lot of them are doing all this stuff just to make their mounts look distinctively different and pretty. Yeah. There's this company that everybody loves, and they make very nicely machined stuff. Max, they're near you somewhere in Pennsylvania. The mounts called Leap. What are they?
Oh, you're talking about the expensive mount?
Yeah, very expensive.
It's a friend of my friend.
Well, I'm gonna crap all over it, so I apologize to.
Yeah, it's the mount that's like $400 or $500 or something like that. Okay.
What's it called? Leap mount?
No, it's.
I always forget the name.
Nick,
what about if it's
Scalar works?
Machine.
Yeah, Scalar works.
Okay, so let's put this on a screen. All right. So looks cool. Looks wonderful. Design is beautiful. Engineering, haven't looked at it too carefully. There are a few things here that I'm not so crazy about. One is, so there is that hinge up top, kind of like on the arc. They're doing it to make it smooth so that nothing sticks out. Okay. Hinge is a potential failure point for a variety of reasons. It's another thing that needs to be tolerance to know that. So there are a couple of screws that hold all this whole thing together. Everything is very scalloped. The screws are really deep inside. I don't know what kind of analysis they did on that. They may have. I have no clue. Everything is scalloped out all over the place. The clamp is actually not Stanex standard. It's a Picatinny standard, from at least the ones I looked at. Maybe they changed. I don't know. So that will give you problems on out-of-spec rails. And the cross slots is a conventional cross slot with this thumb nut that has detents on it. And they're telling you that, as long as it's the same person tightening and loosening it, it's always going to come back to zero. Bullshit. Okay. And they guarantee it. Okay, they can guarantee it, although what if nobody ever calls them on it? Great. And then, would I use one? Perhaps. I don't know. I need to look at it more carefully. Would I pay for one? No. Because again, most of them are going to work fine, and people love them, and they're beautiful. Machining quality is wonderful and all that sort of stuff. But from my general risk-averse standpoint, the way I'm going to play the odds and not cause unnecessary problems on my big fat ass, I'm not going to use something like this.
So here's the question. Based on the price point and the fact that it's made for tactical Timmies, does that influence your decision that it might not need to fit the same needs for somebody who just needs to be able to maintain 2 MOA accuracy versus somebody who's shooting precision rifles or, let's say, a designated marksman, where you need to be able to keep it under 1 MOA, and your average engagement distance is not necessarily going to be 50 yards, but it's going to be, let's say, 300, 400, 500?
Don't care.
Okay.
Rifle scope is supposed to not be the weak. Rifle scope mount is not supposed to be the weak point of your setup.
Cool.
As simple as that.
Now, you said earlier if the hole's all the way through it, what if it's like just ported out like this?
That's called hollowed out. It depends. If they left enough material in there, it should work fine. Could you, went all blurry. It's hard to see how deep it goes, but okay, there we go. So some of this is done, to make it slightly lighter, but in practical terms, it's just there to make it pretty, because the weight of the material they removed is basically zilch, so it's basically just done for aesthetics. But for example, can you get that ring up there again and not block the top half, if you don't mind? Hold it from the bottom so I can see there. Yep. See the top half? See how thin it is at the very top at 12 o'clock?
Yep, right fingers.
There. Yeah, that's a potential problem. Depending, I don't know which material they made it out of, 6061 or 7075, don't know. But this would make me a little bit worried, because this is not where you want to be saving on material, right? You want your ring halves to be stiff. Is it going to cause problems? Most of the time, no. The basic issue is that if it causes a problem, you don't know when it's going to happen. And I don't want to find out at the worst possible moment. Once again, I'm going to play the odds, right? And for me, just looking at that, I'd be concerned. Once again, vast majority of the time, it's going to work great. But not because of the scalloping on the bottom. It looks like they didn't remove too much material. It's because of the thickness of the top half of the ring.
Look at this. I've never seen this hardly on rings. Look at how pronounced this, there's machined out in there.
Yeah, I see that. I've seen that a couple of times. I don't know what the reasoning for this is, other than to make it distinctive looking. I don't know what the reason for that is.
Get dirt and debris in there.
That will help. Yeah.
Here's a question. So basically, we're looking at the ring, and you brought up that companies will do stuff in order to make it look cool. So we've seen rings that are attached with, obviously, let's say, for example, the arc rings with 1 screw. You have your typical rings, which are going to attach with 4 screws. And then this one has 6 across the top. So on a set of rings like that, 4 versus 6, does it make a difference? Or
So if the rings are stiff enough, no, it doesn't make a difference.
Okay.
If the rings are not stiff enough, 6 rings is a potential bigger problem. 6 screws, excuse me, is a potential bigger problem than 4 screws. Because they start interacting with each other. When the top half of the ring is essentially acting as a spring, all these screws start interacting with each other in strange ways. I know some very good shooters who take the 6 screw rings and leave the middle ones out. Okay.
Are we going to talk recoil as well? I guess lugs of rings, rounded, no lug, machined in lugs. What's the scoop on that?
In theory, the square machined ones are better. More consistent engagement surfaces once everything is seated and all that sort of stuff. In practice, with well-made rings, I'm not convinced I see a ton of difference. From a standpoint of return to zero, square, well-machined lugs seem to be a little bit better.
Well, one issue I had with the ones with the lugs, I love when the lugs work out really well, but I've had a set of like higher end rings and I can't fit them into the Picatinny rail because it's like I would have to like really hammer it in.
Well, that's called that can be for 2 reasons. One, if you have a Picatinny ring and a Weaver rail, Weaver cross slots are slightly smaller. Weaver and Picatinny is not identical.
Yeah, no, it was both big.
That's the infamous tolerance stack up.
Yeah,
this cross slots run a little bit thin, and the rings run, and the recoil lug runs a little bit wide.
I have had expensive high-end rifles that have included like rails on them that have weird. They're not standard Picatinny and they're not Weaver. I don't know how else to say it. They're just weird, and I've had problems like with this one. It wouldn't fit because they were too close together as well as too thick. So
that's why we have standards, and if companies don't follow standards, I don't use their products.
Ilya, so while we were talking, since you brought up the Scalar Works mount, would you, not right now, but would you be interested, and I'd be interested in having this discussion with the owner or the designer of the mount? Would that be something that you would
I'll be happy to talk to him. He's going to be very unhappy with me. And the basic problem is that it's a very difficult conversation because for the vast majority of the cases, his mount probably works just great.
Okay.
Right. And again, I did not look at it in too much detail. I've handled it, etc. Looked at it. They're beautifully made, and I like how clever the design is. But again, I think it's unnecessary complexity, and I'm just trying to make my life simpler. I'll be happy to talk to
especially for the price point, because I mean, when I saw them, I'm like, wow, it's so much money. Like, it must be great. And I remember asking you about it before. You weren't 100% sure, and this is the first time that I'm hearing you actually go into the details on it.
So one of my friends at one of the gun companies got one of their mounts, and that one was, and I don't know if they still use it. So there is a difference between Picatinny 1913 standard and Stanag. 1913 is when the rings squeeze the rail from the sides.
Yep.
Stanag is when they hook it up on the bottom and pull it down, which is a better way of doing this. So the earlier, the original mount that I saw from Scalar Works did the Picatinny thing, squeezed it from the side. So if you have a rail that's very slightly under spec, you'll find an interesting thing. As you tighten this thing, the mount tilts. That I saw with my own eyes with the Scalar Works mount at one of the rifle manufacturers.
Ilya, I sent over a link to one of the mounts that I use for my ELO rifle over in Discord if you want to show it. It's in our Discord group.
Let me pull it up.
This mount is probably more engineered than I could ever imagine. The owner of the company is a great guy. I won one of these mounts last year. I stayed at the King of 1 Mile.
I don't see it. Where did you send it?
It's in our Discord group.
In yours?
No, ours.
On the gun tube? Okay, I see one from Derek for Optimum Parts.
Yeah, that's the one.
That's the one. Okay, let me open that, and I will share that one. Okay, Pinnacle scope mount, that one?
Yeah.
Let me stop sharing this one. Give me 1 second, I'll share it. Yeah, I've never seen those before, so I really don't have any insight on them. But I'll be happy to take a look, see if there's anything I can tell you. from just looking at them.
I've really enjoyed using this mount on my ELR rifle. It's made a big difference with
Okay,
the way it locks up, because when you lock it down, there's a cam and a twist.
Okay, let me see.
And it twists and it locks into the rail, which is really nice. Other thing is also with the integrated bubble level. They come from 0 MOA down to 60 MOA, which is really nice.
Okay, they've got reducers. Okay, I hope they're well made.
They are. The reducers are very well
made. I've seen reducers made well and made badly. Yeah, I've never seen these. I don't have any real insight. They seem to be reasonably well machined. I don't know.
Oh, they're very well machined. They're probably, for any of my ELR rifles from here on out, this is what I'm going to use.
Interesting.
I have one on my 33XC. My David
they
Tubbs
have
work.
They have an AR mount, right? AR height mount on it.
Yeah, they do have
There's a cantilevered one.
A cantilever. I've never used their cantilever. I saw it at SHOT
So
Show.
I just got 2 new scopes from Delta.
I'm waiting for my scope to come in from Delta. And the Dark Lord is gone. What happened to him?
Oh shoot!
Oh, there he is.
Oh, there he is.
The one of them is this 1 to 10 with a side focus. I need a mount for it. Maybe if you know these guys at Pinnacle, would you mind? Might as well. I need to test new scopes. Might as well test new mount. If you think they're good, I'll be happy.
I really enjoy mine. I'm actually thinking about taking mine off my ERS rifle and putting it on my PRS rifle, and really playing around with it this year or this next season with it on my other rifle. But no, they're very well made. Everything is machined pretty much from one piece. So I know a lot of guys that are using them. I know I think three or four top 10 shooters from the King of 1 Mile are using that mount. So,
all right, I'll make a mental note and I'll look at them more carefully.
Okay.
Like I said, I don't have any real insight there.
Most people.
Okay. Let's see.
Is there an issue with metallurgy? Like if most stuff now is 70-75 or 60-60, was it 60-61? What if you mix like steel with a pick rail that's aluminum, or the receiver's titanium and the rail's aluminum? Like is there issues with that, or what's the story on that?
In theory, if you go to very cold or very hot temperatures, you can have an issue because they all expand or contract at different rates. In practice, I think the effects in most cases are overblown. On the other hand, like I told you, so I've heard of a couple of cases of arc rings cracking when it's very cold because of the steel pin and aluminum ring bodies, right? So it depends on the design. Steel-based aluminum rings, I would not anticipate a whole lot of problems. Most of the time, there is enough ductility in the material, but I haven't spent enough time on it to have strong opinions one way or the other.
On the topic of metallurgy, there was a question by Fire Prank. Why are more mounts not made of extruded aluminum? Seems like it would save rough out machine time, and a tubular structure would be an ideal structure to prevent twisting between the rings.
Wait, one more time. Where is it?
1151.
All right. Jesus, I'm way behind. There's a lot of stuff.
Some of them you already answered in the past.
Yeah. 1151. Hold on. Okay, 1151 for you. I'm 2 hours behind, so 951.
Okay.
Okay, this one, right?
Yep.
Why are more mounts not made of extruded aluminum? Seems like it would save rough out machine time and a tubular structure with an ideal structure to prevent twisting between the rings. I wouldn't be surprised if quite a few are, quietly. They just don't publicize it. The basic problem is that the machines that do the extrusions are somewhat expensive. So if you're running compared to a small number of things, it's not always so simple to invest in a lot of expensive machinery. And then on top of it, you can do the extrusion, but then after that, you still need to do finish machining. So it takes a fairly significant amount of machine time. If you are running something in low quantities, that given that the material is cheap, it may be just easier to just shove a hunk of aluminum in there and have the CNC machine do its thing. In low quantities, that's probably the case. In larger quantities, people do all sorts of stuff. Look, if I was doing this, I would 3D print everything and then do surface finish machining. Then you can do very interesting, very clever structures.
And we've seen that with suppressors, so I'm surprised we haven't seen 3D printed mounts and things like that.
Because a 3D printer of good enough quality to do this kind of stuff is about $500,000. It's capital investment.
And you
But I mean,
wouldn't be able to make them very fast. I mean, it's not efficient in mass quantity, I don't think.
It depends on what you're looking to do. It's surprisingly, it's not bad. You're using very little material, and one of the advantages of additive manufacturing is that you can do skeletonization on the inside. So you can leave gaps in the structurally unimportant places. So you can actually, if you want the lightest possible mount, the way to do it is probably going to be through 3D printing.
Okay, guys. Sorry to interrupt, but I got to get out of here. We've got some major monsoon showers coming in. I need to go cover up the grill and everything. Thank you for letting me join in, guys. You can find me at Northwest Guns.
Good to have you. Thank you for sticking with us. We'll need to be wrapping up fairly soon anyway. I'm just getting out of the comments.
Thanks, guys. I love doing live streams with you guys. You guys know this, and I will see you guys all in the group.
Absolutely.
Peace.
Thanks for joining us.
Later.
I got to get one pretty soon, too. A few more minutes.
Yeah, he's gone. Yeah, we need to be wrapping up.
Okay.
So, any other interesting questions that I missed?
Yes. So actually, you answered a whole bunch from there. I'm kind of going through them. Since we're talking about companies and basically who would be able to get a machine like that, somebody had a question about the new MDT one-piece mount.
I've seen it briefly. It seemed to be well made. MDT guys generally know what they're doing. I remember not liking the price very much.
And there's the question at $11.59, so 10.
Yeah, it's a $400 mount. Yeah, I remember this, and I saw it at SHOT. It looked to be nicely made, but one of the things you want to be careful with, and I think that was a problem with this one. There you go. So I am going to put this thing on the screen, and I'll show you what I mean.
Yeah.
Excellent.
So the question was, James. So do you think the new MDT one-piece mounts, the ones where you tighten down all the way on one side and then torque the opposite in regards to shearing forces, angular forces, legit or concern?
If they machined it for it, it can be fine. Am I going to be experimenting with this? Absolutely not.
Hey, somebody else had a question about, it was way earlier, and I don't think we answered it. Is there a price point? I think it was along lines. Is there a price point where it's not really worth it to spend that much on rings and mounts? And we kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier, but they were kind of asking maybe what that price point would be.
That's not a simple question. So here's the bottom of that MDT mount. One of the things I don't like about this is that, do you see this long single clamp?
Mm-hmm.
That is generally a potential source of problems, because how the sequence in which you torque and how much you torque it, that will all make a difference, because all these screws now are interacting with each other, because there are 4 screws and 1 clamp, and they're all interacting with each other in strange ways. I've seen ones, and this was with an arc embrace. Okay. Max, I don't know what you just grabbed. I'll maximize you in a Max. I'll maximize you in a moment. Let's look at this for a moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll let you show the mount. Okay.
Well, I want you to talk about it.
Yeah. So one of the things that happens is that I had a guy who. This was I had a guy. I was visiting one of the rifle scope companies, and this scope was sent back, a very nice scope. And the guy said, it kept on shifting 0 laterally, and it kept on trying to dig down to the bottom of it and all that sort of stuff. Couldn't figure it out. Asked the customer what mount he was using. He was using arc embrace mount, and I happened to have that one, right? So I went home and started messing with this. If you screw up the sequence of torquing, it will be shifting laterally continuously for a while under recoil, although technically everything is torqued correctly, because when the screws are all touching the same clamping bar, you can have issues. You don't have to have issues, but you can have issues. Some of the like old Badger rings, etc., they come back when you buy them. They're covered in this Cosmoline, very thick grease, right? One of the reasons is that what happens that when the first time you tighten that damn thing, the mating surface doesn't have too much friction. This whole thing can slide a little bit and settle in the right place where the clamp is holding it correctly. One of the ways to work around the issue of this single wrong clamp is like I told you guys earlier, I basically tighten it, loosen it 2 or 3 times to let it sit. A better way of doing it is to not use mounts with a single long clamp. The only exception to it I know is the old odd mount that unfortunately John's not making anymore. His clamp design was so different that this didn't matter. For all of the ones that I've seen, single long clamping bar is a potential source of issues. Okay. All right, Max, what do you want to show?
So basically, when you're talking about having a mount, let's say, I guess like most people, when they kind of think about mount, like I think a single bar looks kind of really sexy. And so this company, we're not going to say exactly who yet.
Yes, I know who
but
that is. Yes.
They had a same type of design, but then like we're like, okay, well, does this actually make sense? And you had like really amazing input on this, and they kind of went this route. So when you're talking about like, okay, having 3 individual ones, well, there you go. And I guess talking about the pressures on that side, and we're talking about like cutouts in the middle. There we go.
Yeah.
So it's basically, it's interesting, but like for people who kind of want to see like, hey, you can have 3 individual screws there. So, and then anything else you want to say in there? I know I had a friend help out with this one. So, and I think it's really going to hit a lot of the price points. It's like good quality mount for at very attainable prices.
Yeah. The basic idea is that when you're tightening these things, you don't want the torque on one screw to be interacting with what you're doing with the other screw. And a single long clamping bar does exactly that.
Yeah.
You generally want to split them up. And if you look at like Night Force Unimount, they do the same thing. They do it very well. Quite a few of them do it very nicely. But it's not as pretty as nice, long, monolithic clamp. I don't care how pretty it is. I just want it to hold. And yet again, 90% of the time, it'll work just great. I'm trying to play the odds. I'm trying to minimize the probability of having an issue when I least want it. Okay.
Yep.
Is this making sense?
Fire Prank 6 had a question.
Okay.
And it was I have props because I think this is what he's talking about.
About the middle has been scalloped out. This one.
Yeah.
I've used both when they're well machined. I haven't seen any real issues. It just depends on how well they're made. In theory, the one with the center scalloped out is a little bit more flexible. The one in Steven's left hand, that one, yeah. Well, there you go. The left hand, yeah. So right hand, if you're looking at the screen, left hand, if you're Steven. In theory, it makes this thing slightly more flexible. In practical terms, if it's properly machined and bolted down to a receiver that's straight, bedding the base to the receiver is usually not a bad idea if you have any doubts, so that you're not putting unnecessary tension on the mount, on the base. I don't know if I'd be worried about it too much most of the time. I use a lot of EGW single piece rails that are scalped out in the middle. I haven't had an issue yet.
What would you bet a mount with? I've actually never done it.
The same compound that you'd be using to bed in action to the stock. JB Weld, Acra Glass, anything like that. So once again, with most modern actions, you don't really need to. But I shoot some older guns and sporterized things, etc. There, it's not a bad thing to kind of look at it and bed. the rail to the action. The way you do this, basically, the usual stuff: tape off what you don't need to tape off, put some release agent on the receiver. You want the bedding compound to be on the bottom of the base, on the bottom of the rail, excuse me. And
Now,
then you just
now you're bedding it here and here, like at the screw
Correct.
points, right?
Correct,
But
around there.
you're not putting anywhere else, are you? Just
only where there is contact with the receiver.
Okay. It was kind of a stupid question, but clarifying
No,
that.
that's a good question. Don't assume. I've seen people do all sorts of entertaining things. And what you're trying to do, basically, it's almost like scheme bedding. But what you do is that when you are doing the bedding, you apply a little bit of torque on the screws, but don't torque them all the way down, so that the base is not deformed, just kind of finger tight. And then after that, when everything is dried and set and everything, then you torque it down, but the base is not going to be bent. Okay. Make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So
basically, when you want to wrap up, there's, like I said, the question 932 by Buzz. So in optics, we talk the price points on mounts and basically what for somebody to consider, because I think like with optics, it might be a little bit more clear rather than it seems like with mounts, it's like it's all over the map.
Yeah, the basic problem is that it's also inconsistent. It's very hard to tell. So for me personally, I don't want to pay more than $100 for a pair of split rings. Now, for some particularly egregious application, I might just to earn a side of caution, but that's roughly where my bullshit meter starts kind of pinging. And with single piece mount, 200, 250 is generally about as much as I'm willing to pay. Now I have more expensive ones, and they work fine. But I kind of want to know why I'm paying that much. And since a lot of the pretty factor like you get with the ARC or with Scalar Works, etc., doesn't do a ton for me. I'm not hugely motivated to spend that much money. I do have an Aerotech mount, but I traded it for something used because I wanted to. It's that one. It has that adjust the slope thing where you can dial in slope, and there I know what I'm paying for. That's actually not so simple to do well. So if the mount has some additional features that you need, like dialing in the slope or whatever else, that might be worth it. If we're just talking about the mount that's supposed to sit there, stay zeroed, hold your scope securely to the rifle, I don't know. For me, it's a couple $100 for a single piece mount, $100 for split rings. The one exception I'll make to it, every once in a while, if I'm really worried about the application, I'm just going to go buy a pair of Badger steel rings, and it's like $170, $150, something like that. But you can pound nails with those things. So, okay, I hope that answers that. Okay.
There we go.
All right, guys. We should wrap up. If I'm looking at the bottom of the comments, if there is any other good question,
would greasing any single bar clamp help eliminate that? And then
it might. You just don't know. It's not necessary per se, but may not be a bad idea to have a little bit. But it depends on how the clamp is designed. For some, it will help. For some, it won't.
The very last question is actually a pretty good question. I don't know if you guys addressed it before I jumped on.
Oh, we have not. Oh, that is a good question. Did you cover QD levers since they're mostly spring-loaded? All right. So if you care about return to zero and staying zero and all that, don't use QD mounts. How's that? Many of them will return to zero. Some won't. Almost all of them will do something funky during side impact. Spring-loaded mounts is just a bad idea. So I have a few QD mounts. I have a couple applications where I'm just moving this thing on and off all the time. So QD levers are very convenient. Outside of that, it's a marketing gimmick.
There you go.
So in the days before we figured out how to do offset supplementary sites, and everybody was running folding backup iron sites, QD levers made some sort of a sense. God forbid you're in the middle of a firefight. Where all of our urban yappies were all worried about firefights and stuff, except for Steven. He's not urban and not a yappy, but Max and I definitely. We're city slickers. Yeah, we're all worried about the end of the world and all that sort of shit, and that we're gonna rifle scope is gonna be hit with an errant bullet. I need to rapidly rip it off the rifle, flip up my backup iron sights, and just stay in the fight. Right? If you have one of those fantasies, then yes, QD mounts make a lot of sense. I'm old and jaded.
It's tactical. QD is tactical.
Yeah, and I have different definition of tactical.
I think
tactical.
Yeah. I'm just not any sort of a cool. I'm a nerdy physicist. I don't do cool. I couldn't even if I tried. Okay. I do cerebral surprisingly well. That's where my talents end. Anyhow, I think we're going to wrap up on this one. Thank you guys for joining me. I really do appreciate it. And I'm not going to apologize for peeking on you because I really enjoyed that. But it was good to have a discussion, and it's nice to get some different opinions. And based on a number of questions we got, I think we may want to do this again. I'm going to look through the questions tomorrow, probably maybe during the weekend, and see if there's anything there. I should make a list of it. Maybe we'll do. I try to do this every week, every 2 weeks when I can. Next week I'm actually not traveling, so maybe we'll do a follow-up.
And you guys should, if you love this, you should keep supporting Ilya, subscribe to his channel, and maybe that'll encourage him to chop up this live stream and chop these questions down into 1 or 2 minute segments that'll be individual videos.
That sounds like work.
All right, we'll see you here next week where he's going to answer the exact same questions.
Hopefully not the exact same ones.
And thank you to all those that supported his live stream. So, Ian, thank you for the super chat. It definitely does help out. And make sure you subscribe to his locals channel, where he does have many more articles and he shares his thoughts without YouTube's oversight. So even though he is the Dark Lord has overlords himself.
On YouTube, yes. On locals, not so much. But anyhow. Thank you for helping me wrap up. Thank you all, and have a good night.
Good night.